Good morning. My name is Leonard McLaughlin, and I'm pleased to have you all here with us today. I'm the new Vice President of Internal Communications and Diversity and Inclusion here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Today, we're going to have a provocative and courageous conversation, but I think many of us will find interest in, and I think it's going to be a great day today. But before I get into that, I just want us to take a step back and acknowledge everyone that's in the room. Just take a second and look around. A lot of diverse faces, a lot of diverse communities, a lot of different religions, and so on and so forth. So this is what this is all about. But the one thing we all have in common is that we work in the financial service industry. Those around you today are colleagues and members of one of the 19 member firms known as the financial service industry, or better known as FSP. Their logos are on a slide over here, the 19 members. So they really deserve a hand for taking the initiative to step up. The FSP is a collaboration of firms who share common interests to reflect Chicago's diversity and inclusion in the financial service industry. As we were thinking about our collaboration with other financial service firms, it made sense to have a courageous conversation. And I applaud you all for being here today to join in with us in having that conversation. Here at the Fed, we have many ESNGs, is what we call them. The one that's kind of helping to support this group today is the APPG group, or African American Association for Professional and Personal Growth. And they work really closely with the FSP team to put this event together. So I would love to acknowledge Devin Patterson, who has done a phenomenal job as the president of APPG, and Courtney Hollins on my staff, who has definitely done a phenomenal job as well. The title of the event today is called Courageous Conversations: Understanding Privilege and Becoming a Better Ally. My colleague, Jeff Marcus, Senior Vice President and Head of Audit here at the Fed, will moderate our fireside chat with our guests. Daniel Hill, author of Wide Awake, An Honest Look at What It Means to Be White, which in and of itself is truly a courageous conversation. Jeff is truly the perfect leader here at the Fed to really engage in this conversation, as he has a really long-standing career. I think he's been in the business since, I won't age Jeff, 19-something.
Early 80s.
Early 80s, we'll go with that. 1982 if we're really being serious here. I love you, man. During this conversation, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions during the Q&A, and then there'll also be an opportunity afterwards in the post-networking event. I also encourage you to stop by outside. There's some information that Daniel has, as well as some information on what FSP is and what they're trying to accomplish. Daniel Hill is a remarkable man with a great story about how he became aware of his own culture. My hope for each of you today during this conversation is that you'll take a new look and get a new perspective, and maybe find a little bit of self-awareness. And hopefully that will empower you to become an agent of reconciliation and increasing diverse and divided world. I won't go over Daniel's resume here. I'll let him tell you a little bit about himself and his story, and he's on the stage now, so I'm going to turn it over to Daniel. But thank you and enjoy the conversation.
Okay, well, actually, I'm going to go ahead and get this morning. So, Leonard, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I will get even with you a little bit later today, I promise. That's one of the benefits of being the general auditor for Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. I don't usually get asked to do these things, so he knows I'm kidding. But seriously, thank you all for being here today, and especially thank you, Daniel, and for your team, who I know you'll introduce a little bit later in the program as well, for being here and sharing in this, I think, incredible story. Let me tell you a little bit how we'll try to structure the conversation today, because we probably won't be able to do justice to everything we'd like to cover, but we've got about an hour that we're going to spend some time, and I'm just going to really spend some time. The idea is try to make this a conversation between Daniel and I, and all of you. This started out as kind of a fireside chat idea, but it's grown considerably just based on the amount of attendance. And again, we're, I think, grateful to have everyone here to be participating in the conversation. So we will make sure we leave some time, about 15 minutes towards the end of this part of the conversation, to make sure we're inviting you for questions. So just be ready for that. And then there's going to be some opportunity for us to continue the conversation after this more formal part of the day today. So that's a little bit of structure. Does that sound good for everybody? Everybody ready to go? So I'm going to start off with the first question. And really, it's just, I'd love to have Daniel share his story with all of us. And really, I want to know how the journey began for you and what led you ultimately to writing the book that I brought today. I'm looking for a signature a little bit later today, too, Daniel. Wide Awake. So if you can share your story with us.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeff. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm honored to be here. It's really, truly been a joy to work with the FSP team and with the Fed here. And so it's been a great experience already. So thank you. Just give like a very quick sketch for kind of myself coming into this conversation. For those who are from Chicago, I've been a Chicagoland guy my whole life. So my mom is in Evergreen Park at 95th and Kedzie, if you kind of can picture that. My dad was on the edge of Oak Forest and Markham at 159th and Pulaski. So I shuttled back and forth between those my entire growing up years. I was in the business world for a little while, back in the 90s when anything.com would do well, if you remember that. I was part of 3 different startups, and so that's a part of my story, but one I won't get into here. The conversations around race really began when I was on the church side of things. I became part of a large church in the suburbs of Chicago called Willow Creek Community Church. At the time, it was always in one of the top 3 in terms of attendance. It was a very large church, arguably in the evangelical world, the most influential during its time. And so it was an interesting place to kind of grow kind of that aspect of my career. And so it was when I was in my 20s working at this church, Willow Creek, where I had I won't go into how it all came, but I basically had my racial awakening there, where I really came to see just how serious, some of these problems are. And what I didn't understand then now, that I very much understand now, but I think is a challenge for many of us who are white in particular. I thought that awakening moment that I had was the end of the journey. I thought that meant I had arrived, instead of seeing it what I should have seen it. It was the very beginning of a long journey that would be ahead. But I kind of always have had an action orientation, to myself. And so when I really started to have this racial awakening, and I started to realize, I never really was even conscious of the fact that it was an all-white church, and wasn't even really conscious of the fact that I lived in an all-white world. One of the exercises a mentor gave me was just to catalog out who are your best friends, who are your mentors, who are the authors or podcasts you're listening to, and it was just this huge discovery that everything around me was white, and I really wanted to change that. And so my quest was to kind of do it through a church perspective, and so I started a ministry in the city through this suburban church that I was part of, and it was really our intention to have that at the forefront, to really pursue cultural diversity, pursue social justice, try to take some of these things on. And there's a lot of chapters in that story, but the bottom line was I was not really having much success at all, and I was just running into one deeper set of questions after another, and it was really leading to a very disorienting feeling. And so a very key moment in my journey that gets to kind of this book and this conversation, there was an African-American mentor who saw the work I was trying to do and invited me to sit in a small circle with some gatekeepers in the city who were doing racial reconciliation kinds of things, and he intentionally brought one African-American, one Asian-American, one Latino American guy, and then a white leader. And so he invited me in this circle of 4 to share this vision I'd had and this racial awakening. And at that time, I was still kind of filled with language of how I was going to change the world and, all these ideas I had. And so I shared this to these 4. And then they, one at a time, responded to my vision. And the Latino pastor went first, and he said, boy, I'm trying to listen to what you're saying, but everything you say is so paternalistic, it's very difficult for me to hear. And I was so new to this journey, I didn't know what paternalistic meant. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an insult, so that's telling where I was. I was like, I'm kind of young to be a father figure, but if that's how you want to see me, we can. And the Asian American leader went next, and he said, You're talking about building these multicultural spaces, but I haven't heard any sense of knowledge around Asian American experiences and their histories. And I mean, do you only think of this in kind of a black-white grid? And so I thought, okay, I'm furiously writing notes. And then the white leader, who's just kind of a very gruff guy, he said to me, he said, man, if I had $1 for every white leader who thought they were going to solve problems of race, I'd be a rich man by now, right? Like, I don't even have the energy to listen to this conversation, basically. Okay, that's super inspiring, thanks. And then the African-American leader went last, and he put his hand on my shoulder, which was a sigh of relief. I thought, all right, this is going to go good. He said, Daniel, you seem sincere, but these are complex problems, and you would just save yourself a whole lot of trouble if you just quit while you were ahead, and go back to kind of what you're doing at Willow. And then I was like waiting for that. I was like, oh, that's the end. That was his advice to me. He had heard the very best of what I had, and that was his advice. I was, oh, that's cute, but you should go back to what you're doing. And it was that was the much more important awakening moment, because that's when I realized that despite this feeling now that had been arising in me that something's wrong and I need to participate in it. I certainly would have never thought of myself as racist at all. I always had the kind of proverbial one friend that wasn't white, and it was part of our family value system to treat all people equally. It's not like I was an overtly recovering racist, but realizing that just because I'd suddenly become awakened to this and cared about it didn't really mean much at the end of the day. That when I looked at myself, I thought I was further along, but when this guy sat across from me, what he saw was somebody whose thoughts were still so naive, it would almost be better if I didn't do anything. And so that was close to 20 years ago. So I've been on this journey. The book I wrote is very much coming from that. It's not how I reached white enlightenment. It's about how I've learned to become awake to, ironically, what I don't see. And I think that's the work that often has to happen, is seeing what we don't even see and building that into a way of life, of learning and continuing to be exposed to the many things that we didn't know before.
So here we are, kind of a couple decades right now into this journey for you a bit, and you talk about this, emphasize how to see, to see more clearly. And again, you talk about how that was really part of the, I think, impetus to write the book and share that journey with the readers here. So what help us understand really what you have come to see more clearly. What does that really look like? What is it that you believe that readers, particularly of the book, participants today, what is it that we need to see more clearly?
Yeah, it's such a giant question, right? But I'm going to kind of take one approach to this, and this hopefully can be part of our discussion today. Even this conversation, one of the things that's so confusing is there's so many terms that get used synonymously, right? I mean, we talk about diversity and inclusion and ethnicity and multicultural and multiracial and nationality, and there's so many terms that get used back and forth, right? And if that's not confusing enough, we could actually say the same term, and a lot of you are in this work, and we might all mean different things when we say the same term, right? So I think the work we have been doing, both internally in our organizations, we've got church and a nonprofit that kind of work side by side, and then as we've been doing consulting, one of the things we're trying to do is develop kind of a clear distinction between two sets of ideas that seem both critical, but also feel really important to delineate from each other. All right, so this is going to be the long answer of all the ones we do. I'll be more brief after this, but I think it's hard to kind of, without creating some common vocabulary here. So the first category I would say is the one that's going to be much more familiar. I'd say diversity and inclusion is one of the really important categories around this. All right, and just out of curiosity, how many of you directly work indirectly in diversity and inclusion and what you do? Right. Okay, so it seems like about a third of you. Yeah, so I've had a lot of conversations even beforehand. It feels like for a lot of you, this is the stuff you're thinking about all the time, which is great. So diversity and inclusion is one conversation and a critical one. When I put these two next to each other, I'm not saying one cancels the other out. I'm saying I think they have to run in parallel tracks. So diversity and inclusion is responding to, it cuts across the board. Churches are struggling with this, nonprofits are struggling with this, organizations are struggling with this. And it really comes from, at some point, a recognition happens like, oh, our field, our organization, our company is predominantly white. And has been predominantly white for a long time, and there's not clear paths of access into it, and there's not people of color who are regularly becoming part of the organization, and if they do come, they're not staying, and if they stay, they're not moving into leadership positions, right? So that tends to be the driver behind that, is a recognition that we don't have diverse spaces. Our spaces are not particularly inclusive to folks, and that needs to increase, right? And I would certainly say that is, of course, a critical conversation. That is some of the nuts and bolts stuff that certainly has to be addressed. So I would fully affirm the importance. And some of the words we use, like ethnicity and culture and nationality, I think that they all fall in this category in this particular conversation around diversity and inclusion, right? That's probably the more familiar. I would suggest that it's really important that we create a completely different category and don't intermix them too much, where we talk about race as a separate thing. Now, often that term just becomes part of the vocabulary, right? That's not an unfamiliar term, I realize, but it becomes part of the same conversation within diversity and inclusion. And I think if you can't pull it apart and have a separate conversation around race, it actually ultimately undermines the efforts around diversity and inclusion. All right, so if we were going to talk about race separately, what would we be talking about? For this part, I'm going to rely heavily on, you all know the name Bryan Stevenson. Have you heard his name? If you haven't, I would really recommend getting familiar with him. He's the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, which is a legal organization that represents folks on death row, and they've just overturned dozens and dozens of wrongful death convictions. It's really amazing work, and they're located in Montgomery, Alabama, right kind of in the heart of where the slave trade was happening. And so he's got some really brilliant ideas around discussing race, and that was really formed in the classroom with the young lawyers who are really trying to understand this stuff. So he uses this term. This will be the one time I do this. Will you repeat this with me just so we can all use, because we're going to use this term a lot in our conversation. Will you say, it's a handful, the narrative of racial difference?
The narrative of racial difference.
Thanks, yeah. So here, he uses this to describe the construct of race and to delineate this from the conversation around diversity and inclusion, right? So the narrative of racial difference is this. So race is a human-made system, all right? So whereas ethnicity and culture and nationality has been around for as long as human beings have, race, relatively speaking, is a young system. You know, a lot of people who study would say it's 400 years old or less. And again, I realize for many I'm preaching to the choir, but let me just create some vocabulary here. So race built these social categories, all right, off of perceived differences physically, which science debunked long ago, that's not based on scientific biological difference, but there's these perceived differences that racial differences get recognized, which that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem, this is where Stevenson's term becomes important. The biggest problem is that there's a narrative that went with the recognition of racial differences. There was a story that created a racial hierarchy. It said all human beings are not created equal. That's at the foundation of the system of race, is this belief all human beings are not created equal. There's different levels of intelligence, different levels of capacity, different danger levels, different proclivities towards violence. Like there's these stories that went with the creation of race, and that's the narrative of racial difference. Right? And so this system of race, you know, we could have long conversations about these, but it's really tied to some of the worst things we've done in our human history, right? So the narrative of racial difference was key for colonialism, for instance. Right? If you're going to have white European people coming from different European countries into lands that are already inhabited by native folks, if there's going to be violence, if there's going to be displacement, if there's going to be even genocide, that goes against the human conscience to do that, right? It goes against the human conscience, everybody's human conscience. So you have to create some kind of a story to make allowance for that, right? You have to make some kind of a story that the people who were there first are violent or are savage or are merciless or didn't belong there. There's got to be some kind of a story to allow for, right? So race begins to form. The one Stevenson focuses on, so I'll do that here too, he focuses on the institution of slavery and how important the narrative of racial difference was to that. Right? And I've seen him do this, it's so powerful. When he's sitting in these rooms with the young white lawyers or when he's with the young white pastors, I've seen him do it here too, he'll say, we have got to ask a very difficult question. How is it that so many white folks got behind slavery? Right? Good, normal people, just like we would be today. Christian, when he's in Christian spaces, right? We were the ones, it was white Christians who created the theology for slavery. That's a really uncomfortable part of our history. Right? He says, how did otherwise moral white people get behind this? Because it wasn't just a few, right? It couldn't have survived without mass appeal, right? Without the bulk of people. How did otherwise morally bound people get behind the system of slavery? It's the only answer is the narrative of racial difference. There was a story created that there is a human difference between black people and white people. That white people are more inherently human than black people. And you know, nowhere is this more clearly notated than in the Constitution. When fighting over taxation, black people were called 3/5 human. That was later turned over by an amendment, but black people were called 3/5 human in the Constitution. And that pretty much is the stamp. That's what Kendi calls the stamp from the beginning, that there was this stamp right from the beginning that said black people are 3/5 human, white people are 5/5 human. If you're Asian American, if you're Latino, if you're mixed race, it creates all this confusion of within this kind of stamp that's been created of a racial hierarchy. And it's really painful to talk about. It's really sad to kind of continue to acknowledge. But it's what's at the core of the system of race. Right? And so Stevenson, when he's, this is a very typical response, and those of you who've led these conversations in white spaces, you hear this oftentimes. A lot of white folks will often say, well, okay, slavery was terrible, and I can acknowledge slavery was terrible, right? But I didn't own slaves. by forefathers that owned slaves. What does that have to do with today? And so last kind of idea on this, and then we can move to what's next, Jeff. So Stevenson helps us to see you can't really deal with the system stuff without also dealing with the narrative. So to say a different way, the narrative, the story, it's in the soil of the fabric of what our society systems have been built on. And so if there's this story in the soil that says there's a racial hierarchy, that human value is tied to where somebody falls on this racial hierarchy, well, then systems get built on top of that. And the systems have to be confronted. There's no question about that, right? So in 1865, slavery got overturned, and it's important it did, right? That's not insignificant. But if the system was built on the narrative in the soil, if you knock over the system but don't get to the roots, right? Anybody who gardens knows what happens if you pull a weed up at the top and don't get to the root. It will always come back. He says, so this is what ties it to where we are now. I think when you begin to open your eyes to it, for those who don't already see it, you start to see this narrative of racial difference is just as powerful today as it ever was. And in some ways, you could almost make the case it's more dangerous now because it's more subtle in the way it works. It's not just, you can't just overtly do some of the things that were done, but the story that's tied to the system of race is still in the soil that things are built on. It's in the air that we breathe. And I think if we can't separate out the differences in these conversations, diversity and inclusion, dealing with how do we attract people, how do we retain people, how do we develop people, very, very important, right? But if all we end up doing is attracting people where this narrative is still fully at large and try to retain people in that, right, it ends up undermining the very work we're doing. And so if I was going to bottom line, what I think is important to see, I think the distinction between those two conversations and not one canceling each other out, both of them being important and having their own place.
That's pretty impactful. I think what you just talked about, and if we're not uncomfortable, we're going to get more uncomfortable going forward. And that's part of I think our goal for today. So I do want to spend a little more time in moving forward, talk about white culture. And let me share a little bit about my story as part of this, just maybe to help set this up and just share a few highlights with the audience. And even when Jamaica, Devin, company asked if I would participate in this program and gave me a little background about the book and kind of some of the work you've been doing and share this notion about white culture, I had to pause for a minute and let me explain why, because I really didn't think about a white culture. Usually what I've probably been used to hearing is talk about white as a race, not necessarily as a culture. For example, my own background. So I was born north side of the city of Chicago. My parents moved very early in our lives. I was probably less than a year old to a suburb called Morton Grove, so just a little bit north of the city. Was raised in the Jewish faith, so it's another, I think, really interesting connection for me in reading the book and learning a lot more through the lens of Christianity and what you also talk about there. I did face anti-Semitism throughout my life, but particularly some of my earlier years growing up with that community. Most of my friends were not Jewish. They were, from a cultural background. That's what we really talked more about. Was I had a group of Italian friends, a group of Irish friends. It was not very diverse in terms of certainly people of color, but cultural differences that we would talk about either kind of were based on either my faith or some of what they believe from more their Irish or Italian or German heritage. So when I started to think about, again, there's a culture, a distinct culture that is white versus kind of what I grew up in, that was kind of another very important kind of moment for me as we've continued to connect and talk and reading the book. Something else I'll just share, kind of early development part of my journey and I think awakening too. I was very fortunate. My dad and his two brothers, my grandfather, they started a small manufacturing business, and I got exposed to that. I used to love going with my dad to work when I could in the summers, and just the floor of that small manufacturing company, that was very diverse. There were people of all walks of life, and I had an opportunity to work on the floor of the factory and really get to know people. I was pretty young in high school probably at that time, or I'd go out with my dad on his sales calls, and he called on, again, his clients were extraordinarily diverse, small business owners in the kind of the food and restaurant business. And just watching my dad and his interactions with people and how he treated people. Now I'm reflecting back at the time, I was a goofy teenager. I didn't, I was just enjoying being with my dad, being with my family in the business, and I just enjoy people and getting to know people. I thought it was kind of a kick that, I was there. But I reflect back now and how much impact that's had on me throughout kind of my professional journey, I think, as well. So I thought I'd want to share that background. I also think about sports as being a great bridge across racial lines. So sports was very important to me growing up. I played, baseball, basketball, football, the more traditional sports at that time. My sports heroes growing up were predominantly African American. I'm a big Cubs fan. People around the bank know that about me. I'm not bashful about that. Ernie Banks was, he was clearly my hero. I was probably this close to him on one of my first Cub games. I got to go trying to get his autograph, but got crushed. But to me, that was like the moment of my, early childhood. So those are, I think, just some important aspects about my, kind of growing up and learning, just all, kind of as part of this whole journey for me. Let me pivot real quickly to kind of my professional career. So I went to undergrad school in Northern Illinois, studied finance, was very fortunate to be offered a position here at the bank in the finance department. Great place, thought to start my career at the Central Bank of the United States. Thought I'd be here for a couple of years and move on, and now 36 years later. I know Charlie's shocked by that statement, but it's not uncommon. Very grateful to, and so for me, as I've been here for, as Leonard pointed out, a pretty long time. Thank you, Leonard. It's been very interesting for me now, again, to reflect back on the bank's journey, particularly around racial issues, diversity and inclusion. And I'm going to fast forward to more after I'd been with the bank 12, 13 years. So mid-90s was in my view, a very pivotal point in the bank's journey, history, because we're a 100-plus-year-old organization. Michael Moscow came in as an external president. He replaced our prior president, Silas Keene, who was a terrific leader as well. Michael came in at a time and I think really reflected on kind of the state of the bank and recognized that there were some things that really needed to change about the bank. We went on this journey. We called it the Fresh Look at Bank Strategies. I happened to be in a strategic planning support role, so I got an opportunity to support some of the work that my boss at the time, Glenn Hansen, and Bill Conrad, our first vice president, and the executive team at the bank really started leading us down a very different path as an organization. And it had a lot to do with strategy, but one of the biggest changes and impact at that time was a very intentional change in our culture. And something that really, I think, helped create the Burning Platform for us at the bank was, for the very first time in the bank's history, we did a survey of all employees of the bank. And we partnered with external firm, Ernst & Young at that time helped us with this project. And you could only imagine, and we got, a high response rate at that time. Today, we're very proud. We do these engagement surveys every 2 years, and we have, almost 95% participation rate, which is phenomenal. But even back then, the first time we did this, we didn't kind of know what to expect. And we got, you can imagine, great response. And then for the very first time, Michael took the bank's executive committee and vice presidents off-site over a weekend, and part of that day was to listen to the report out on the survey results. It was not good. It was to me a kind of a low point, and clearly, was I that aware? No, not really. But you can imagine the emotion in the room that day, and the full range from people like saying, "Yeah, I told you so," to very defensive, argumentative. But it was necessary. It was kind of part of, I think, again, to use your words, kind of part of the awakening process perhaps here at the bank. And recognize we had a racial issue as well as clearly a diversity issue. We weren't talking about diversity and inclusion as much back in the 90s, but clearly we had some serious issues that had to be addressed. And so I think, to the leadership team's credit at that time, we really rallied around that, as opposed to kind of putting it away and denying. We use that as I think, to me, as a pivotal point to move forward through this very intentional cultural transformation work. That has really, I think, helped position us for a lot of the great work that my colleagues, who I know are here in the room today, and the bank at large, has been able to move us even further down this path around diversity and inclusion. And I'll just mention a couple key folks along the way that I think are really important to kind of acknowledge and recognize. And again, part of my experience, I've had the privilege of working for a lot of different very talented leaders in this organization. 3 more recently of my leaders I had reported to, all African American, 2 women, one of the first senior vice presidents of African American here at the bank, Angie Robinson. People that worked here a while know Angie and love Angie and respect her. And I just had the good fortune of being assigned to some of her responsibilities, and someone that was a big advocate early in my career, was very, very helpful learning from her. She was recognized by we created this partnership too with Chicago United, and Angie was recognized as got some wonderful leadership recognition for Leader of Color Award. Very impactful. And later on, Val Van Meter, who I think is on the phone today. Val really helped create in partnership with many of you here today, the Financial Services Pipeline Initiative, was the first OMWI for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. OMWI is an acronym, Office of Minority and Women Inclusion, which was created as part of the Dodd-Frank Act out of the financial crisis that formally required the financial services regulatory agencies, including the Federal Reserve, to establish more formally this role, even though we've had EEO officers and other people in the roles that were working on diversity and inclusion in the bank. But Val was another tremendous, very impactful leader who I, again, had the privilege of getting to know and work with and help support some of the work that she did in this space. And I just want to also certainly acknowledge today, as part of my role as general auditor, I report to the audit committee of our board of directors, Bill Farrow. Many of you might know Bill and certainly Urban Partnership Bank. And I've had the privilege of now reporting to Bill the last couple of years and kind of learning from him. And before that was Rick Waddell from Northern Trust. So all people that are very engaged in this conversation, I think, have had great impact and has continued to help the bank. But I also need to recognize my colleagues that are here. Charlie Evans, our President and CEO, Ellen Bramagen, our Chief Operating Officer, for their continued leadership, along with my executive committee colleagues. We're having these courageous conversations. It's becoming, I don't want to call it routine because it's not, but we're addressing issues that have typically maybe not have been addressed in creating the forums. Leonard talked about the employee support network groups, which I know you'll talk about a little bit later as well, and the important role that they play in the organization and moving our culture to be more inclusive and more diverse. And also, Nokomis Willis, I know, is on the phone today. I want to acknowledge her leadership and efforts in this space. So, long story short, to get to the next question about white culture, and going back to my reaction, thinking about white culture. So let me kind of turn it back to you to talk more about kind of the premise around this white culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a complicated question with a lot of nuances, a lot of layers to it, right? But even the term whiteness is an important term to wrestle with, because when different immigrant folks from different European countries originally came, they weren't called white, right? They were Irish and Dutch and Polish and British and right, representative of that. And so even that gets to this kind of very uncomfortable way in which the system of race was created, where this category of white was created. And unfortunately, the category of white, it marries together some hopeful things with some destructive things. And that's the hard work when trying to kind of wrestle with what white culture is. If we go, it's often, the analogy often gets used that when a fish tries to describe the water it lives in, it's very difficult, right? You have to almost like create separation from it. So I think for white culture in particular, it's so ingrained with what we think of as American culture. So we have to kind of pull those apart, right? So to me, one of the just clear snapshots of the two things kind of being hooked to each other is if we go back to the Declaration of Independence, right? And the Declaration of Independence at its heart has this very hopeful, beautiful vision, right? It says that there's a creator who has given every human being unalienable rights, right? To pursue what? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? Now, it did say all men, so women were included. So even the vision itself in its original version was only half hopeful. But let's just give them the benefit of the doubt and say they were intending that for, right? Now, in so many ways, I think that's a snapshot of what we call the American dream, right? That anyone can come into this place and be successful and work hard and experience success, right? And so there's a lot to, there's something powerfully aspirational in that, right? And in the exact same document that said all men are created equal, exact same document, final paragraph, it talks about Native people. And it calls the Native people, this is the term it uses of Native people, it calls them merciless Indian savages. Now, this isn't speculation. Go look, anybody can look this up. This is the final paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. So in the exact same document where we're saying all human beings have been created with unalienable rights, we call people who lived here first. And we don't just exclude them, which is bad enough, but it's hard to come up with more charged terms than that, right? I mean, merciless is a charged term, right? Savages is a charged term, right? So this is the hard reality about the creation of white culture is there's these aspirational visions and the narrative of racial difference is baked into it right from the very beginning. The same thing that articulates this vision for what can be creates a category for Native people right off the bat, and then everyone who wrote that owned dozens and dozens and dozens of slaves, right? So they're already operating off of the 3/5 perspective that black folks, which I hate saying this out loud as a white male, but it's what our history is, right? There was this narrative that said black people are less human than white people and can be owned by white people. That's baked into this dream that we have, right? And so it becomes threatening for those who have never really considered this before, but we just can't talk about the aspirational parts without also talking about the kind of, the narrative of racial difference that's kind of baked into it.
So tie it back into the business world and the business culture and how that is really kind of what you're seeing as you work more closely with us in the business community.
Okay, so I'm suggesting these two kind of parallel tracks, right? So you may or may not agree, but I got the mic right now, so we'll go with that for now, right? So let me give. So when we're talking with folks, here's kind of three categories of thought, and of course each of these would be much longer conversations. But to kind of start the conversation, and maybe we can circle back because I think we're going to talk about allyship a little bit too. So maybe we'll do two passes. But let me create some categories of like action that I think we could think about doing. Right. First one would be this. And I've kind of alluded to this a number of times already. I think it's important to create common vocabulary in our organizations. I think not only do we misuse terms oftentimes, but even when we use the right terms, we don't mean the same thing. And it's really difficult to create momentum when you don't have common vocabulary. I just last week did a consultation with an organization that's really sincerely trying to grapple with this stuff. And I'm the third consultant they've had in a year, and they're just in disarray. So they said the first consultant who came in talked to us about how to become a more multicultural organization, right? And so this person had some thoughts about how to become more multicultural. So they put that into practice, felt like they made some progress, felt they got stuck. They brought in a second consultant they thought could take them farther. This consultant said, no, you need to become an intercultural organization. They said, what's the difference? I said, multicultural means you're still white at the center. You need to be intercultural instead. And so introduced a whole new kind of thing, and then they went that direction, got even more confused, right? And now they're saying, so which one is it, multicultural or intercultural? I wouldn't really use either of those terms because I think they're both problematic. Like, oh, great. But so hopefully settling in on these two tracks can give you a little bit more runway on this stuff, because I do believe that even if you don't use these exact labels, I think these are two conversations that have to be had, right? Again, I think there's one conversation around attraction, retention, development for the ones who are very serious about it, moving folks into leadership positions. And then there's a separate conversation about dealing with the reality of race and how that impacts all these things. So if I was going to create a bucket around that, I'd say that's the first one. It's just even the importance of creating some organizational commonality around the terms, and then making sure you're using the terms that get to the different kind of arenas that have to be addressed. Second, these probably go in increasing, if we're talking about courageous conversations, right? I would say the second one does require a lot of courage and fortitude. If you were going to use that kind of a paradigm where you're separating out diversity and inclusion versus conversations on race, I think in some form of another, whether this is the language you used or not, somehow or another, we've got to acknowledge that race isn't, I don't know how to say it, race is a sickness. I think I just want to say it like this. I think it requires organizational courage to call race a sickness, which is a different conversation than diversity and inclusion, right? That doesn't necessarily get to this conversation. The narrative of racial difference is a sickness. All right, we just had Brandon's here, one of my colleagues, works both on the church side as a pastor and on our nonprofit side as an executive there. He had this instance with one of the core families in our church. And I don't say this to demonize, I actually say this to show how pervasive the sickness is. And there's a white core family who's very much bought into the things that we're doing, very much taking this stuff seriously. They have a 7-year-old daughter who, Brandon's a little scary with kids anyway, so they don't always warm up to him. But no, sorry, not really. But this girl was having trouble warming up. She finally warmed up one day, and so we were going across the street to a park at the neighborhood school across the street. And so as they prepared to walk the street, she asked him a question more honestly than she'd ever asked him before. She said, Mr. Brandon, do you carry a gun? He said, no, why would you ask that? She goes, well, that's what your people do. You kill people, right? And his heart just like broke in that moment, right? Because that's not some girl that belongs to a KKK family, right? This is part of a family who deeply cares about this stuff. But by 7 years old, she had already internalized this sickness that said there's differences on this racial hierarchy, and there's different attributes that come with it. And I don't think the point of that is say there's a bad person and we don't want to be like that. The point of that is say, no, it's a sickness. It's Brian Stevenson uses this. Dr. Beverly Tatum, who wrote Why Do All the Black Children Sit Together in the Cafeteria, uses this image. They call it kind of a pollutant that's in the air. You can't live here and not breathe it in. And so I think that's a category of action. And it does require courage because that's a different conversation, related, but it's a different conversation than diversity and inclusion initiatives, right? Can we say in our particular organization, whoever it is, we're not even talking about who's racist, who's not racist. That's not the point of it. To say it's a sickness that's out there. It's a sickness we all carry. There's just no chance to ever get well until you can say you're sick, right? So I'd say that's a second category. And then I would say, I think a third category I would say, and this is particularly relevant to those of us who are white. I think there may be application beyond that, but let me just speak to kind of my own experience. I think it's really important that we change the metric of how we define success. All right? It isn't always broadcast this clearly, but generally speaking, when those of us who are white or those of us who have been shaped in white environments, when we think of racism, this is the kind of general operative definition we have. Racism is basically thought of in terms of good and bad. So racism is when bad white people do bad things to people of color, or say bad things to people of color, right? So it's got kind of a good bad binary. And so therefore good racist people don't engage in those kind of activities, right? They believe in equality. We believe in equality. It's thought of in terms of good and bad. And so there can be, and often is, and I don't want you to understand, I actually think this is hugely problematic. One of the things that happens in white communities is we spend all of our energy trying to prove we're some of the good white people. That we get it, that we're on the right side of this thing. And success then is determined kind of by this good-bad binary. Right? And I just think it's a poor approach. Of course, I would prefer people don't be bad. That's not the point of, but I don't think it gets to the problem of race. The problem of race, if you're following my progression here, the problem of race is it's a sickness. This narrative of racial difference is a sickness that all the implicit bias tests show this. We all carry the sickness, right? That attributes more positive things to whiteness and more negative things as you move down the racial hierarchy. And I don't think this metric for success should be good and bad. I think the metric for success should be, am I actually truly aware of the fact that I carry a sickness? And I think that would change a lot of conversations. Ironically, we have the word for it. We call it woke. My wife always tells me don't say woke in public because it makes you sound pretentious, so I'm not saying it. But the nature of the word actually does get to it. Like, it's much more important to be awake than it is to be good or bad. And awake to what? I would say you got to tie it to the sickness. Awake to the fact that this is an endemic sickness that none of us can escape from. And if we try to prove we're on the right side of the sickness, what does that even mean, right? Like, instead, we need to say, do we have the courage to have these conversations around saying the sickness is in our organization? Because it's in every organization. Right? It's not reflective of us ultimately. It's reflective now what we do about it changes from a person-to-person level. But I think that's a courageous conversation to be able to even change the degree of metric of how we talk about that.
How do you start that conversation in any organization? What have you experienced? What have you seen, Daniel?
Well, I guess I've just got a general belief, not even in these conversations, but anything. I mean, this goes from marriage all the way to organizations working together. If you can't see the same problem, you can't ever solve it together. Right? So if you have different perceptions of what reality is, there's no ability to move forward. And so that's kind of a deeper answer to that, having the same language. I think creating some kind of capability where we're actually saying we see this as problematic and together we're going to try to address this. And, Zora Neale Hurston, one of the great Renaissance writers, I love this quote she said. She said, you will never have true friendship until you have a true danger that you share together. Common danger makes common friendships. And I think until we see the danger of the sickness of the narrative of racial difference, I think the D&I conversations will always, they'll be handicapped to go to their kind of full measure, I would say.
All right, let me take what you've just shared, and I really want to tie it to part of the reason we're all gathered here today, certainly from the thinking about the objective of the Financial Services Pipeline Initiative, which is to increase the overall representation of African American and Latinos in the Chicago financial industry. What are some ways that this coalition, that we can respond?
Yeah. Well, we put the word ally in this title, right? And so again, if I can use this distinction of the two tracks, both necessary, I think there's certain ways that we can improve on the diversity inclusion side, and I think you all are working hard on those. But I think thinking through attraction, retention, development, moving into leadership. So I'm not going to maybe address those a bunch. Let me go back through the 3 categories I just did. So I'm saying we need to have common language, right? So I think the onus is really on those of us who are coming from dominant culture perspective to ask myself, am I seeing the same things that those who are really aware of the system of race see, right? Do I really see it? And that's an important question, because oftentimes we'll answer yes for ourselves, and that's not how everybody else would answer. I just did a consulting thing with an organization that, every white person who works, the very fabric of this organization is around diversity and inclusion, and the white folks there consider themselves very woke on this stuff. But the people of color who work there said, we think you need to have a separate white people conversation because we don't think you see what we see. And I think it's just very telling, right? We have to keep coming back to, until we see the same thing, it's going to be very difficult to create any kind of progress. So I'd say that first one. The second one I'm saying, having the courage to call it a sickness. This is where, God bless you, this is where, again, I think you're modeling this very well, what you're doing right now, Jeff. So here's what happens a lot of times in these conversations. The folks who see it as a sickness the clearest tends to be the ones who have most personally experienced the adverse nature, right? And so they can see it the fastest. But when in our organizations they name it, and it's almost never a white person, right? When you name it as a sickness, there's defensiveness. It's dismissed. The burden of proof is put on the one who's claiming it's a sickness, right? As if somehow that's not already understood. And so there's a very powerful potential when those of us who carry the sickness in a way that we're not aware of begin to put language around that, even when we don't know what to do about it, even when we don't even know what it means. But it creates a space, it creates a humility, it creates a learning posture. And boy, would I love to see some organizations where the white folks were the ones who would start the conversation saying, this is a sickness that has to be addressed. I don't know what to do with this, right? In fact, I guess just to even add on that one, I think that was one of the big learning things for me as a white leader. If I go back to that kind of good-bad paradigm, when I started this church 15 and a half years ago, I thought what I needed to do was prove to people of color that I was the woke white guy who gets it, who really lives this stuff right, and that was just completely unimpressive, to people of color. It's the more I tried to convince them how much I knew, the more you can kind of feel like, oh, good Lord help him, And it was when I started talking about the sickness and how I'm just becoming aware of the sickness, and I don't even know what to do. To me, that went against everything I'd ever learned about leadership. Right? They're supposed to know where this thing's going, right? But I had to say, I don't actually know. Then all of a sudden, my most trusted companions in this journey said, okay, well, now we can talk, right? We never expected you to have the answer, right? We need some white folks who will sit at this table and wrestle with this stuff. So
you talk a little about self-righteousness as part of that path and journey. So is that in part what you're really helping us understand what we can overcome?
It is. There's when, and I always want to risk overgeneralizations, but let me do another one. When it comes to us who are white in this journey, we tend to fall into blindness on one side or the other, and they're both problematic, and I can't figure out sometimes which one's worse. So there's one kind of pride or blindness which just refuses to acknowledge that this is a problem, right? It just requires ongoing convincing, and there's this defensiveness and dismissive. So that's kind of one form of pride, one form of blindness that we see a lot. But then there's another kind where you take on the mantle of feeling like you're the woke white person who knows everything, and that kind of progressive, know the right vocabulary, but still aren't. It's like becoming aware of your blindness did lead to a way of life then of embracing blindness. It became, I arrived, now I can kind of position myself as that kind of self-righteous, awakened white person. And that's really hard to work with too, because it wasn't like I woke up to this and now I've arrived, right? Like this is, even for this conversation, this circle that's here with me, we sat in a circle and I said, you all got to help me. My thoughts, I don't know which ones of these are right, which ones are wrong, right? And those are humiliating and powerful conversations all at the same time, right? To have people mirror back and go, oh, good Lord, don't say that. And more importantly, not just don't say that, but here's why, right? Here's what it's still reflective. Right, why do I not see that still, right? And that, my learning curve continues to be, and so I think there's something very important of not feeling this pressure to prove that we get it. And if I can even go one more degree further on the transformation side, it's not even about positioning ourselves correctly, it's about coming to an honest assessment of ourselves that we're bound up in this struggle too, right? That my own humanity has been distorted by this narrative of racial difference, right? I'm not just trying to be the woke white person. My own sense of self has been distorted by this sickness. And so my liberation is tied up with the liberation of others. Right? It's not always equal the way this captivity falls out, but it's a captivity nonetheless. And I think it changes the frame of how you approach these things.
One of their topics we promised we'd get to before we turn it over to Q&A here shortly is term white privilege. It gets discussed in these conversations. So what role do you see privilege, Daniel, playing in really in what you've presented?
Certainly privilege is a term that belongs in a lot of these D&I conversations. So I'm only talking about race on this one. You know, I think when it comes to privilege, to be white doesn't mean you haven't struggled in many other arenas or haven't been marginalized in other ways, but to be white in this system means your humanity was never overtly questioned. Your humanity was never overtly questioned. And so you never had to live under the threatening nature of saying you're less human, less capable, more dangerous, more of a risk. You just never had to do that. And so that's a profound privilege to have never had your humanity questioned. And I think probably the most practical form of privilege is, I like Reverend Julian DeShazer, who's an activist in Hyde Park. He defines privilege like this. He says privilege is the ability to walk away. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, that's probably the clearest manifestation of privilege, right? Is if my livelihood's not at risk, well, I can walk away whenever I want, and I can go back to normal because society is structured in such a way for it. And so that's a very volatile dynamic to bring into these circles where I can appear interested for a time, and then just if I don't like the way it goes, I can just walk away again. I mean, that's a tremendous privilege to even have the ability to walk away when we want.
All right, one final question before we turn it over.
You make a good Baptist preacher. That's not your tradition, but
I'll never go
Yeah,
floor
yeah.
at this point. Once you get me rolling, that's, you know, my colleagues know that's it. They're in trouble. We touched on allies earlier, and I know there are a lot of motivated allies, advocates. I would hope to consider myself one of those who really want to work for progress and transformation in these areas. So what thoughts do you have on, I think, how in particular white folks, allies,
Yeah.
you know, how can we be better allies?
I guess I'll finish with these two thoughts. So one, so a trick with a gathering like this is probably the ones who most need to engage with this aren't here, right? So hopefully it's spirit of conversation for all who are here, but at some level you're already interested in this, which is good. And that doesn't mean there's not a lot for us to still learn together. But that becomes some of the most important ally work, right? Is to go for the spaces that are resistant to this reality, right? How do we till the soil in those kind of environments to kind of create these spaces for courageous conversations? Another one, and since we've talked about this, I mean, I think this is more of a 301, but important. So if we adopt this idea that narrative racial difference is a disease, it's a sickness that has to be addressed, if we can kind of flow with this idea that blindness to sight, and I don't know if I said it as clear before, that the transformation I think we need to make in terms of success is to go from good, bad to blindness/sight. I think that's the way we need to measure progress more, is can we name this sickness more and see it? So this is another kind of very tender dynamic in so many organizations I work with. When we start getting into this a little bit, and especially in these kind of white-led organizations where their intentions are sincere, but it's still kind of up for grabs whether the impact's going to work or not, the kind of white-centric organizations will often create these affinity groups where those who are most marginalized by the system of race, can have dialogues about it. And so I think that can be a really, really positive thing. In fact, I think it probably is necessary. But now it gets to the question, so what happens, right? And so if it's just kind of a token thing where spaces are created for folks, well, then it didn't really move anything forward, right? But if the true genesis of this was that those who are creating these groups are afflicted by blindness, and we need these groups to speak back into our blindness and have positions of genuine authority and influence that the organization can respond to that. Now the courageous conversations are set up to happen, but it requires a lot of will and fortitude on the ones who are in power creating these spaces to then ask the question, how did these tables change, where these things can actually really be impacted.
Excellent. Thank you. Are we ready?
Yeah.
All right, let's go. It's time to hear from everybody out in the audience. We'd love to get your questions. There's one in the back. Love to see the hands.
Hello, Felicia Foster at BMO Harris Bank. I had a question with regards to, one, it's great to get to the point of acknowledging that there's a sickness, but I think that there is some work that needs to happen before you even get there, to which in many cases, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily at my particular company, but in conversations that I've been in, is that before even acknowledging that there's a sickness, sometimes there's this component of reverse discrimination. And so how do you get under the root of bringing that into the conversation to address that particular issue, to then get to a point where you acknowledge that there is a sickness and then be able to make impact thereafter?
Before you end that, can I ask a follow? Are you saying like white folks will often say there's reverse discrimination and that
When you-
kind of stops them? And like,
Right. When you bring forth the idea around diversity and
Yeah.
inclusion, the comment is, well, that's reverse discrimination, and how do we get to the point of including us into this conversation as well?
Right.
So how do you bring that forward into the conversation of diversity and inclusion so that you then become an ally of then admitting that
Yeah.
it's a sickness?
yeah, I think it's a very good question. It's deep on a lot of levels too, because it's just part of human nature. We protect our self-interests. That's kind of always our first pass when we're confronted with things, right? And so oftentimes fear or what am I going to lose, it kind of rushes over people, and it compromises their ability to have thoughtful conversations around this, right? And so at that level, this is a deeper answer than I can get to, right? Because how somebody can get past their own fear and self-interest, I don't know, that's why I became a pastor, because sometimes I think God alone can do that. But so I want to just acknowledge the depth of that one. I think frameworks are important, right? So you've heard me say this a number of times now. I think this framework that Brian Stevenson uses of kind of separating out the root that's under there, the narrative racial difference, and the systems and structures on top of it. I think one of the things, and I don't think this excuses the fact that so many white folks respond this way, but one of the trappings is that the conversation turns into, for lack of a better term, almost like policy debate, almost immediately, like what's the right way to respond to some kind of a thing. And this is where I tie it again to the blindness of sight. When somebody responds like that, what that says to me is they still don't see the bigger issue, right? And so they're entering into a debate when they don't understand what's really happening under the surface anyway. And so what I try to do in those situations is say, I think there's a time and a place to have that debate, right? So if there's a historic lack of access for certain people groups, and we're trying to address that, like we can have some policy debates, in terms of is affirmative action the right thing or not, right? And I'm not really even trying to get into that right now. But what I really try to emphasize is if you're unwilling to kind of participate in the conversation of how we got to where we are, then this is a stupid debate, really, at the end of the day, because we're going to spin in circles, right? Because we're not even talking about the same thing. So this idea, again, this notion that until we see the problem the same, we can't move forward the same, I actually think that's a very typical kind of mistake we make is when we're having this debate at the policy level, there's this assumption that we're all seeing the same problem, but we're not. Clearly, we're not seeing the same problem, right? So that's where I think we got to get back to that conversation at some point, because that stuff is real, right? But that's where I think there has to be. This is how Stevenson says it, and I like it. He says you always got to be coming at it from both sides. There's a policy side of this, or system structure, and then there's the narrative battle. And too often we underemphasize the narrative battle. And I think to get to this one, which is still complex, we have to have a pretty strong amount of time put into the narrative, the what's under the roots as well.
Up here.
Hi, I wanted to ask you the question or what your opinion is on the value of education when it comes to, because really the things you're talking about, they're learned behaviors. We know that if you put 3-year-olds together, they'll play, they'll have a good time. As they get to be older at certain ages, 12, 16, we start to see the separations, the discriminations, the learned behaviors. So many times when you're talking about working with a group of adults, so today we're all here because we wanted to come. We weren't forced to come. It's something
Right.
we have an interest in. But there's a vast number of people who aren't here today, who have no interest in this subject. How do you reach those people to reverse their thinking, to allow that different prospect to change? And again, my question is what do you think the value of education is, perhaps in the educational system, to sort of teaching this? Because to me, you got to start early.
I'm trying to qualify my answer because I'm a pastor. I'm not trying to proselytize, but if I can appeal to just how I think of this from a spiritual perspective, from the Christian tradition, you never want to start with trying to manage behaviors because it's at the heart where things flow. So you're concerned with behavior, but you're also concerned at the heart at the same time, right? And our belief is it's God transforms the human heart that then leads to changed behaviors, right? So I guess that would color my answer a little bit in the sense that I think there is a place for managing the behaviors. How did Dr. King say it? The law may not change a human heart, but it can still get me from being killed, right? I mean, it's certainly the behaviors are important on that. But I think in education, I think part of that. But again, I think the more difficult education, I think, is how do you eradicate sickness? That's another another painful story from our community. But we were talking about this on the church side, and Anderson Cooper a little while ago, CNN, he did a modified version of the doll test. I don't know if you've ever heard that one, but it's an old test where there's a white doll and a black doll, and they measure children's responses to it. And so he did an updated version. He goes into this classroom and he films it, and so there's 5 little girls on this poster, and it goes lightest skin, bluest eyes on one eye, darkest skin, darkest hair on the other. And then he asks this beautiful little 5-year-old African-American girl, which one's the prettiest? And she goes all the way, to the white girl. And he says, which is the ugliest? And she goes all the way to the darkest. And he says, which is the smartest? She goes all the way to the white girl. He says, which is the least attractive? Very painful. I didn't actually set it up very well because it was a very painful moment for a Black community to even show that, which is kind of a side conversation. It's important how we create these spaces to have these conversations. The point I want to bring out of it, there's an African-American family in our congregation who has a 4-year-old Black daughter who they've been telling is beautiful since the day she was born, told her that she's brilliant since the day she was born. They said, there's no way it goes that deep. So they went home that night and recreated the test for their 4-year-old daughter, and their 4-year-old daughter did the exact same thing. They put it in front of her, their beautiful little Black daughter, pointed to that white girl and said, that's the smartest one here. Right? And you just see these and you go, man, that's the hard work of education. Like, how do we, and I agree that we have to, the sooner we can intervene on this, the better. But the reality is in our workplaces, we're not working with folks who have breathed this disease in for decade after decade after decade, right? Often been very defensive about it. And so that's where, again, I'm not trying to pit these against her. I think the diversity and inclusion kind of tactics are important. And then there's this other one of like, how do we find healing for this sickness and be able to talk about it?
Let me follow maybe on that question you touch on it about one of the typical tools we use in organizations is D&I related training.
Yeah.
You have a perspective, thought about the effectiveness of that as part of the solution?
So I guess just the most simple level, the way I'd see it is D&I is really critical. And if what we're doing is bring people into sick spaces without addressing the sickness, right? Like, so it has to be coupled together, right? Like, we do want to create paths of access and of retention, and most importantly, into leadership positions where they can actually help us change the sickness, right? So again, I don't see them as in any kind of competition with each other as much as just needing to be coupled together in a really meaningful way.
One right up here.
Hi, thanks for coming and talking about this. A couple things I would say. Number one is that it's not just awareness of sickness. You've also got to want to get well is one thing. And coming to forums like this or a number of things, I look at it as an opportunity. I hope I come away a little less ignorant because I'm constantly, with my upbringing, very much Chicago and all that, you saw the world one way, and it's the experiences and talking, the communication that's so important. My biggest concern is we get a lot of these great forums and stuff, and they're great starts. How do we sustain it? You're not seeing it often enough. It's like, okay, we're going to finish this, we're going to go back to work, we're going to get back into our routines. And it's not enough. We're not having the conversations enough because it's always the beginning, but how do we keep it going?
Do you want to start? I'll jump in.
Yeah, please. I realize the Fed is just one of the 19 organizations here in the FSP, but it's been refreshing here. I didn't know Jeff before this experience, but it's atypical of how I often, usually when I'm in these spaces, those who are in the leadership positions who are white are defensive right from the go, right? And very much trying to save face, very much trying to portray all the advancements the organization's already made, and that lack of humility is just a challenge, right? And I realize we can't all change the leadership structures of the companies, but I appreciate the model. When Jeff talked about this, he said, man, I care about this stuff for a long time, but I've got a lot to learn, and who else can we talk to keep advancing? I just think that humility especially of those who are in leadership, to kind of create space for these things and then to make changes based on it is really important. So please take it from there.
I'll just add from, again, my perspective. So we talk sometimes about D&I as being an initiative, which almost suggests it has a start and a stop date. And I think part of my story here that I've shared today is it really, you hear the term journey being used quite a bit, but frankly, that's what it is. I think one thing we do try to do and want to continue to evolve our journey here is you got to make it part of the everyday conversation. We need to tie it more directly into, when we talk bank strategy, we want to really make sure it's embedded in our strategic priorities for the organization. So it's not a start and stop. It's something that you have to be very, I think, vigilant about, making sure that that conversation and the importance and the intent of it continues to get clearly communicated. It's hard. I'm not going to suggest that it's not, we've had our own shares of starts and stops along the way, but you have to have, I think, this extraordinary commitment to it to make sure that it continues to be amongst the top priorities of an organization. Over here, one over here. We'll go here first, and then we'll pick you up second.
Hi, Deetra Jackson, CIBC Bank.
Nice to see you.
Hi, Jeff. Just to piggyback on that question, what's your view of, in order to really get it into the organization, including it into individual performance management? And having metrics around that for each individual in the organization to have a D&I or I&D metric within their goals and objectives every year.
And I know some of my colleagues from People and Culture are here in the room that have been working very hard on that topic a bit. And so something we've done recently as part of our bank performance management model is we get rated not only on the what we achieve, but the how we achieved it. And so our People and Culture team, working with the bank's executive committee, just recently refreshed our bank leadership competencies, and including a specific competency around really inclusion, and are we being inclusive leaders? And we take that very seriously, and so that is now part of how we are assessed on our performance. So again, I think it's very intentional. I think it's one step in the process, but I think it's more than symbolic. I think it's important, and I know in our conversations we've had as a leadership team, we put a lot of weight on the how, as frankly as much as the what. We don't want to make sure people are not being inclusive in getting the results. We recognize how important it is, and that's the way we are, I think, increasingly holding ourselves accountable in the organization, and tying it to things like performance compensation and things like that. So, but we're just, we're taking some baby steps in that space too.
Hi, good morning. Corliss Garner from BMO Harris Bank. I love your insights on how you approach individuals who get defensive about the conversation. And I was just at a conversation last night, and an analogy clicked for me in that your comment about the sickness. I think we all have inherited this sickness, right? Mm-hmm. And if you think about your own individual family scenarios, if I inherit diabetes or heart disease from my mother, it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility to deal with it. Right. So how do we have that conversation with folks who get defensive about this conversation?
I wish I had a more optimistic answer. I mean, somebody can't grow if they don't want to grow, right? Somebody can't get well if they don't want to get well. Somebody can't live in the light if they don't want to live in the light. And so I try to do my very best to encourage and invite and prod and poke, or whichever is the right kind of thing at the time. And there's lots of encouraging stories of folks who are, moving forward. But I mean, I think that just 10 of our country shows right now, there's a whole lot of folks who are not only not willing to move, but are doubling down to kind of defend, what I think is a very blind position, And so, that's why I have to keep a foot in both the spiritual world and the secular, because there's a part of this, like besides prayer, I don't know what to do for some folks, because it's something has to happen on the inside for people to move.
Question over here.
So you just touched on the current political climate and the people and I think everybody in this room is outraged at the Charlottesville, or that somebody can't be judicious simply because of their ethnic background. But going back to the word privilege and how defensive people can get, and having the courage to speak up and say, when somebody talks about people clinging to their guns, to their antipathy, that we stereotype these communities that feel like they're being left behind and that they don't have a chance to actually pursue that happiness. How do we have an open and honest conversation on both sides of the aisle?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. I'm coming back frequently to this kind of perspective that I think we share, that it's a sickness. Using this term, the narrative of racial difference, describe the sickness, right? So one of the real tightropes, so for instance, in faith communities, you're not supposed to overtly talk about politics, right? And so one of the tightropes I'm trying to walk is saying, look, when people in public leadership positions say something that touches on the narrative of racial difference, we need to call that out, regardless whether it's Democrat or Republican. So it's really important. It's not seen as a partisan thing, right? So we've multiple times before ever getting to something like gun issues or incarceration or immigration, though I think they're very important debates to have, I try to, again, help people get in contact with the sickness, right? And so this particular administration regularly uses the narrative of racial difference, all right? So in ways that are profoundly explicit in our history, right? So when it talked about immigration, you remember he said, why can't more immigrants come from, was it Norway that he said? So it's an explicit appeal to kind of white-centric countries, and then, allegedly called a curse word for the countries from Africa, right? I mean, that is just the literal narrative of racial difference, right? When there's these multitude of kind of synonyms used for people coming from Mexico, whether it be rapists or animals or different kinds of ways, it's literally invoking the narrative of racial difference, right? When at the naval base recently, he talked about how in our country, we tamed this country, which is a literal appeal to the narrative around. And so I wish folks, whichever side they were on, could acknowledge that sickness when it is spoken into the air in explicit ways, regardless of what their political persuasion is. And so I'm not having a ton of luck with that, but I think it's the word, like again, I'm like, we should be able to acknowledge the problem. And I think what left-right should be is like, what do we do about it, right? But the problem should be able to be agreed on. And so that's a lot of the work I'm doing these days, is just to see if we can kind of get folks who are not aware of the sickness to become more aware of the sickness.
All right, I'm getting the cue in the back, so we're gonna pause here, because we do want to carry this conversation forward. We've got another about half hour or so, I think, planned, that we can do some more networking, and I will continue the dialogue and Q&A. A couple things before we adjourn from here and make the transition just out in the lobby area here. One is, can you join me in just thanking for Daniel for being here today? I know I couldn't do justice to try to just summarize what we talked about, so I'm not even going to try. That's why I think it's important we continue the conversation, but how much I personally appreciate the time we've had a chance to get to know each other and work together, and I really do. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. You want to recognize, I know, some of your team that is with us today, so that we can also have those conversations.
Yeah, this is my brain trust, so I'd love to invite you to come meet them. So starting from here, you'll see we got Priya, Ivan, Christine, Shamika, Keith, Shireen, Brandon, and Eric. So these are all our folks. You don't need to remember all their names.
Stand up, wave, say hello.
Yeah.
So we know who they are.
So
thank you.
We have a very unfair arrangement that they're the brains of the operation. I end up being the ones who converse about this stuff. So if you are looking for some kind of practical ideas, that'd be great. Shamika also is kind of representing kind of the consulting arm of what we're doing. And so, if anybody's interested in ongoing dialogue. And awesome. Am I allowed to mention that we've got
Please.
So we've got a nonprofit. We've got a big gala next week. So this is kind of my naked appeal. If anybody would like to come hear about some of what we're doing on the ground, would love to invite somebody to that. So we've got literature back at that table as well. Thank you.
One other public service announcement. After today's event, you all will be receiving a survey inviting feedback. So I really encourage you, this is coming from the FSP, so please take a few minutes after you leave today when you get the survey. We need your feedback. We really want to hear what you thought of today's session and give us your thoughts and ideas of how we continue this conversation and what else we should be talking about going forward. So again, Daniel, thank you. Thank your team. Thanks the AAPG and Financial Services Pipeline for helping sponsor this event, and really appreciate all your support. So thank you.